The balance of power in the Middle East is shifting. Iran is on the defensive. Its military capabilities were badly degraded by last year's 12 days of Israeli and US strikes, and growing protests at home have made the regime look more vulnerable than it has in years. And as that balance changes, a growing number of commentaries suggest that Turkey may replace Iran as the region's next destabilizing force. And much of that argument rests on the assumption that Turkey under Erdogan shares the same Islamist agenda as Iran's theocratic regime. Today, we are going to unpack that. Where are the real similarities and the real differences between these two countries? Not just in their current politics, but in the deeper historical structures, institutions, and ideologies that have shaped and constrained democracy in both. Welcome to Rethinking Democracy with Gönül Tol. And joining me today is Karabekir Akkoyunlu. He is a research associate in politics and international studies at SOAS University of London, and he's the author of the new book, Guardianship and Democracy in Iran and Turkey. Karabekir, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Congratulations on the book. I'm halfway through. It's a great read. It's really fascinating. I'm looking forward to reading the rest of it. And I think it's quite timely. You know, we don't say these things about new books usually, but yours is, I think it's quite timely because, you know, your book is comparing democracy in Turkey and Iran. And it really got me thinking lately, especially in Western editorials and Washington think tank circles, there's been this growing argument that Turkey is becoming, quote unquote, the new Iran, right? That under Erdogan, it has morphed into an Islamist autocracy. And I remember this one in particular, a New York Times editorial a few months ago suggested that Turkey has slid into Islamist extremism. Now, I mean, what struck me is how different this framing is from the past, because for years, and even during the early AKP period, Turkey was portrayed as the polar opposite of post-1979 Iran, secular, pro-Western country and the model for the region. And obviously, I have my own views on these comparisons, but let me start with this. In your book, what exactly are you comparing?
Right. Thank you. First of all, you're right that these comparisons are not coming out. Turkey is becoming Iran, and I feel like it's a little bit going full circle because this is exactly what we used to hear and talk about in Turkey in the 1990s. Is Turkey becoming another Iran, or with the election of the AKP? Then we moved away from that, what I would call a hefty deal of scaremongering, to different comparisons and expectations of Turkey. And now we're back in the same framework. And I think it's equally problematic today as it was back in the day. And the book actually does start from, at least the story of the book, start from that initial experience of seeing Iran through the prism of Turkish politics and Turkish society as someone who grew up in Turkey in the 1980s and 1990s. We would only conceptualize or think about Iran as the boogeyman, as the dystopian other of Turkey, which is something that Turkey, secular Turkey, could turn into if we're not steadfast in our protection of secular democratic characteristics. And then I realized over time, as I went into academia, became a comparative politics scholar, that this was telling us more about Turkey than Iran. And actually, I didn't know much about Iran, which is a major power right next door to Turkey. And I started taking an interest in Iran, its history, its politics, its language. Took several trips there. And when I was there, this is in the 2000s, late 2000s, this is how far back the story of the book goes, I realized that not only were these knee-jerk comparisons of secular Turkey versus Islamic Iran, or at that time it was turning more into Sunni Turkey versus Shia Iran, overly simplified, but they were concealing something that to me was more profoundly interesting and consequential. My first visit to Iran was in 2009, and it was right after the major uprising that followed the 2009 elections. And talking to people, interlocutors, friends, contacts there, I couldn't help but notice how many of the themes that they were talking about were similar to the ones that we were talking about in Turkey, even though context was very different. And one of which stood out was the concept of guardianship, this concept of vesayet in Turkey, and it's used as velayet in the case of Iran. And there was this incessant discussion about how this pursuit or push or yearning for democracy was being constrained by regime guardians that were constantly looking over democratic processes, suppressing them, drawing red lines in both countries. And I thought this was worthwhile digging into. And that's where the book came out of. In a nutshell, what the book tries to do is to move beyond these knee-jerk dichotomization of Turkey and Iran and compare them and their institutional architecture as what we call in political science jargon tutelary hybrid regimes. In particular, in the pre-AKP or until the early AKP era, compared with Khomeini's Iran, I look at how both polities established out of revolutionary processes led by charismatic leaders, Atatürk and Khomeini, led to the emergence of a hybrid system where unelected regime guardians acting in the interest of revolutionary ideals, safeguarding the legacy of the charismatic leader, or just general understanding of national security and national interest, saw in them a right to constrain, meddle with, and suppress democratic institutions and popular competitive processes. So the story of the book is a little bit that personal background, but also the comparative framework tries to move beyond these simplistic dichotomies and tries to then understand what is similar, but also what is very different in the two cases.
I want to come back to, you talked about hybrid regimes. I want to come back to that. But before that, I want you to unpack what do you mean by guardianship. So you are basically comparing how there is the structure, the system of guardianship embedded in the system in both countries and how that is problematic. So explain what you mean by guardianship very briefly.
Guardianship is the political manifestation of a social legal concept of acting as, if not the parent, the responsible being for somebody who is not capable of managing their own affairs or taking care of their own interests. So an adult is a guardian of a minor, a tutor is a guardian of the tutee, a student, and the political implication of that is the existence of a set of actors or institutions which see in themselves a duty to take the people by the hand and tell them what's right, and in doing so set certain boundaries and constraints on what democratic politics can do or and cannot do. Now, as I conceptualize it in the book, this, Turkish system of guardianship is quite different from the Iranian one, although they share certain essential characteristics. But it's not just countries like Turkey under strong military influence or Iran under clerical guardianship that we see a semblance of guardianship. I think one of the interesting things for me in delving into the concept of guardianship was how it's also relevant for democracies or democracies that are dealing with populist ascendance and where politics become a contestation between unelected guardians of the liberal order versus the sort of so-called speakers or representatives of the people. So this tension between unelected guardians and representatives of the people is something that is embedded in a lot of political systems, whether they're hybrid or more democratic. So I think the Turkish and Iranian examples, as different as they are from one another, they are not parochial, and they actually speak to some of the other cases that we are very familiar with these days in the Western world.
Well, so to recap, the whole idea of political guardianship, whether it's clerics like in Iran or generals in Turkey, it rests on this assumption that society cannot be trusted to decide its own future, and that, by definition, cuts against democracy. Now, I want to go back to this notion that the notion of hybrid regimes, right? So you described both Turkey and Turkey from 1960s to 2011, right? And post-revolutionary Iran as a hybrid regime. So you're saying that in both cases, there is at least some democratic element mixed into an otherwise illiberal system. Uh, Of course, in Turkey, that is easier to understand, right? There were competitive elections, alternation in power, and there was this real opposition space. But Iran, I mean, that is less intuitive. Even, I mean, when elections are held, candidates are vetted, so the playing field is very much controlled. So why do you consider the Iranian regime, and I mean, we're talking about post 1979, a hybrid one? I mean, where exactly do you see the democratic component there?
Right. So uh, I think, yes, there's this notion that Iran, since 1979, has been a theocratic dictatorship, um, and where will of the majority, will of the people, has been ignored or suppressed. Now, I think that is more and more true. And nowadays, I don't think we can speak of much of a democratic component in the Iranian system, but this wasn't always the case. And the book looks at the institutional evolution of Iran in the long term, and explains how what I think was a very important Republican component that was in there from the get-go in the Islamic Republic has been gradually dismantled. But in its conception, the Islamic Republic was created as a hybrid regime in the sense that it represented two uh, different visions, two strongly rooted but different visions. On the one hand, this yearning for democracy and republicanism that goes back to the 19th century in Iranian history, with a lot of different episodes for revolution, reform, and a type of a representative constitutional system. And on the other hand, this system of Islamic guardianship, which found a voice in Ayatollah Khomeini's theory of velayet-i faqih. And the Islamic Republic institutionalized these two different visions in its own body, in its own name even, Islamic and Republican, and in the constitution as well. More sort of explicitly, more clearly, the Islamic Republic featured an elected parliament, an elected president, competitive elections. Yes, they became gradually more controlled, and that's also a process that took that accelerated over time. And there's been a filtering process of who can compete in the elections, but nonetheless, there was always, at least until the last years or so, a sense that the Iranian public could participate, and there was a real choice, and there was fierce debate, and the outcome was not preordained. So that democratic component, albeit limited, constrained, much more so than in the Turkish case, was there. It wasn't just a facade. And that actually gave hope to Iranians for a long time that the system could be reformed from within. And it separated Iran from a more straightforward dictatorship like Bashar al-Assad's Syria or Saudi Arabia, for instance, which is a theocracy indeed. So that element, I think, is often missing Today, it's not really quite there anymore, but the story of how it became dismantled is, I think, crucial to understanding how Iran got to where it got.
But on the surface too, Karabekir, it feels, I mean, almost awkward to compare these two cases, Turkish and Iranian cases, when you think about their ideological foundations, right? The Republic of Turkey was built on Atatürk's secular nationalist vision, and the Islamic Republic rest on Ayatollah Khomeini's doctrine of faqih, the guardianship of the Islamic jurists. So, given such fundamentally different founding principles, how do we meaningfully put these two regimes side by side?
So the comparative element is the institutional architecture. It's not ideology. And so in a political science terms, I think my contribution, what I want to do beyond just this being a study of Turkey and Iran, is to show how this notion, this regime type, tutelary hybrid regime, can manifest itself in very different ideological or geopolitical or social political settings. There are other tutelary hybrid regimes which are, I think, fascinating and very different from both Iran and Turkey. Thailand is one other example, a military monarchical type of guardianship. So I think the differences are very clear between Turkey and Iran, and they're consequential. But once we set the comparative framework of what is similar, we can then focus on those differences and how they play out in the elite politics and popular politics of the two countries. And then they do have an impact, of course. Secular nationalism of Atatürk, and outgrowth of the Enlightenment thinking, westernizing and modernizing ideology is very much inimical to Ayatollah Khomeini's vision. And the two men are very, very similar, but they all, even as two leaders, they share a certain characteristic as charismatic leaders of revolutionary movements who put an end to millennia-old monarchical systems to establish republics that then turned into hybrid regimes. So that's the interesting, I think, comparative element. And if we look at that process of a regime establishment and consolidation, but there's also similarity between Atatürk and Khomeini, which is something that would infuriate the followers of both men, in the sense that they acted in a comparable way in their ability to put together rainbow coalitions, united around a single cause. But after that initial goal was achieved, how they were ruthlessly pragmatic in the way they consolidated power and were able to impose their vision on the polity. Now, secular nationalism and ideological sort of Islamism of Khomeini, of course, they make a difference. One major difference, and I emphasize this in the book, is that in the case of Atatürk, guardianship was not envisioned as a permanent fixture on society. The idea was that with the modernization paradigm, Turkey would, with the help of the revolutionary cadres, mature into a type of civilized democracy. Then it would be able to manage its own affairs. And that created the legitimacy problem for the military, which, when it's kept on intervening in politics.
Yeah.
In the case of Iran, Khomeini's system was designed as a permanent fixture on the Iranian population. There was never a sense that everybody would be an Islamic jurist one day. So that creates an interesting dichotomy difference and has an impact on how the regime see their legitimacy or their own limits when they want to interfere in the society and politics.
I find this really fascinating. I mean, the role of ideology, how, I mean, you are you're focusing on the institutional structure, but I mean, ideology is something really strong. And I want to come back to how that ideology, I mean, Turkey's founding ideology and the Islamic Republic's ideology, how that actually transformed these two countries into what they are today. So I want to unpack that a bit more. But going back to this notion of political guardianship, in Turkey, the AKP came to power, promising to end that tutelage. And it curbed the military, sidelined the power of the generals, dismantled the old guardianship system. But instead of paving the way for deeper democracy, Turkey ended up in a place where rights and freedoms have eroded more than ever before. So, what does that experience tell us about Iran? I mean, if dismantling guardianship doesn't automatically produce democracy, then what does that say about the prospects for political change in Iran? Or, I mean, does it say anything at all?
It does. One of the main arguments of the book is it's a warning against reducing politics in these tutelary regimes to a clear-cut battle between authoritarian guardians and democratic civilians, and whereby if you dismantle guardianship, you automatically end up in a democratic place. That was in many ways the sort of implicit assumption in Turkey in the early 2000s. Maybe we're simplifying a little bit, but there was a sense that once Kemalist guardianship is dismantled, Turkey will be a liberal democracy. And that did not happen. And Turkey, in that sense, serves as a cautionary tale, not just for Iran, but also in this case, very much for Iran. So I think in similar vein, if tomorrow or the day after this edifice of Islamic guardianship collapses or is transformed, a consolidated democracy, I don't think is what's going to come out of the current spectrum of possibilities. Especially because compared to Turkey, Iran is in a much more volatile situation. There's a quasi-civil war happening between state and society, which is much more violent than anything Turkey has experienced. Democracy is much more profoundly trampled upon and has been much less firmly grounded anyway. And there is a much a more extensive intervention by foreign powers. So these do not bode well for a democratic transition in the short run. In the long run, it's another question. And also the opposition is raising eyebrows into the possibilities of a democratic transition, especially the opposition outside of Iran. You need the opposition to guardianship also to be democratic and show democratic credentials, and that's another issue with, I think, especially the diaspora in the case of Iran.
Yeah, well, what you're saying is all very relevant to the Iran debate that we're facing these days, right? I mean, there's an impending attack on the U.S.-led attack on Iran, and people are, after the protest, they're feeling a lot more optimistic about the prospect of regime change, and the question of what comes after then becomes important. And so what you're saying and also what we've seen in the Turkish case, it's very relevant. I want to dig a bit deeper into this comparison between Turkey's ruling party, the AKP, and the Iranian regime. The AKP has Islamist roots, although even that label is debated. Still, I mean, many critics argue that Erdogan's system today isn't all that different from the rule of Iran's ayatollahs. And of course, I mean, there are important differences. Iran's regime is rooted in, as you mentioned, Shia political theology. And then there's a specific doctrine, while the AKP emerged from a Sunni Islamist tradition. But if we set aside all those sectarian and doctrinal distinctions and focus on the broader political project, so when you look at the kind of Islamist state building the Iranian clerics pursued after 1979, do you see anything comparable in Erdogan's trajectory? Is there a similar totalizing vision at work in Turkey?
I hate to bring up this quote because it makes me sound like Tom Friedman. But when I was in Iran, I spoke to a cab driver, and he said something that I still in one of my previous visits. I think this was in 2015. And it's what he said is stuck with me. He said that Erdogan is your Ahmadinejad, but now he wants to be Khamenei. So he wants to be your supreme leader. This
Very
I thought
perceptive.
very much so. I think there is a similarity in the trajectory of autocratization in Turkey under Erdogan, and in the way power has been maximized at the executive level in both countries, and the gradually personalizing character of the entire regime apparatus, the security, not just the political system and the bureaucracy, but also the security apparatus, the economy, suppressing the opposition and rendering the ballot box less and less meaningful. I think that is not just, but I think that's a wider sort of authoritarian trajectory that we see in other countries as well, not necessarily a similarity in the Islamic theocratic sense, because there are, I think, bigger differences. Erdogan is a lot more pragmatic. He's a lot less ideological. He is also operating in a much more fluid institutional environment, both at home and abroad, which he himself is able to shape, as opposed to, say, Khamenei, who functions within the rigid institutional framework of the Islamic Republic, and also its rigid geopolitical possibilities. So Turkey, I mean, Erdogan is able to maneuver politically from one alliance to another in a way that no politician in Iran is able to do. He's also able to shift alliances or maintain alliances between foes abroad in a way that is not possible for the Islamic Republic. So I think in that sense, we're looking at a very different political game in Turkey than that of Iran. One similarity, I think, one similar trajectory is Turkey, like Iran, has been investing heavily in self-defense capacity to that in order not to rely on outside allies who may be shifting, so not to rely on NATO or the US. That, of course, also has implications for regime survival and long-term sort of politics. Yeah.
No, that's striking, and I'm glad you and I agree on this, because whenever the issue of how similar Turkey is to the Iranian Ayatollahs come up, my first reaction, which is something that I covered in my own book, is that I don't see Erdogan as this Islamist ideological leader. I mean, he's first and foremost a populist, and he picks and chooses different ideologies, whatever ideology serves his interests best in that moment. Um, so I think making that distinction is important, because again, in the Western commentary, there's this notion that everything that's wrong with Erdogan's Turkey has something to do with Islamism. That is not the case. I mean, a bigger problem is autocratization, and yes, ideology can serve that goal, but that's not the main problem here. I have a follow-up question. How did you think Turkey's Islamists view the Iranian Revolution? I find this really fascinating, because my sense is that it didn't really land the same way across the board. I mean, different factions within Turkey's Islamist movement reacted differently. Some inspired, the others were cautious or even skeptical. How do you see it?
Yeah, precisely. Well, Islamic Revolution, when it first happened, sent shockwaves across the Islamic world, not just Turkey, and inspired a whole set of Islamist thinkers and actors, not just in Turkey, but also in Turkey. Initially, it led to the emergence of a pro-Iran Islamism, İrancı İslamcılık, which grew as a sub-branch of the wider Islamist movement. Now, this İrancı Islamism was never a mainstream, but the influence of Iran was, and Iran's sinister hand was suspected in across the Islamist spectrum by the Turkish state at the time, and in the 1980s, especially in the 1990s. So Khomeini's revolutionary message resonated with and emboldened the anti-Western, anti-secular disposition of Turkish Islamists in the 80s, and also his search for an alternative modernity is something that inspired a lot of people, but that influence waned over time as the Shia and also the Persian character of the Islamic Republic became more visible, more pronounced, and created a certain boundary to the level of cooperation between Sunni Turkish Islamists. But still in the 1980s, especially the 1990s, the fiercely secular Turkish state portrayed Iran, as I said, as an existential threat to the republic's secular character. And with the emergence of political Islamists in the elections in 1994, municipal elections in the 1996 parliamentary elections, Refah Partisi, Welfare Party of Erdogan, the big question became, is Turkey becoming Iran? Erdogan did have a good relationship with the Iranians. He had an anti-Western, anti-colonial thinking. He even flirted with the idea of creating a D8, as opposed to G8, which of Muslim countries coming together. And you might remember this, one of the triggers for the soft coup against his government in 1997 was a celebration of so-called Jerusalem Day in Ankara, where the Iranian ambassador gave a fiery talk against Israel, which at the time was a major ally of Turkey, the Turkish military. But as you said, there was always a strand within the Islamist movement in Turkey that was suspicious of Iran due to its Shia and Persian character. This is the more Sunni and more Turkish nationalist segment of the Islamist movement. And the main example of this is the Gülenists, the Gülen movements. Fethullah Gülen from Erzurum, very heavily shaped by this anti-Iranian sentiment. And when they were in power with Erdogan, that sort of this was a point of tension between the AKP and the Gülenists. And you might remember, again, I'm sure you do, when Hakan Fidan, when Erdogan's ally Hakan Fidan was exposed for carrying out backdoor negotiations with the PKK in Oslo, one of the things that the Gülenist journalists and Gülenist spokespeople insinuated was that he was an Iranian spy. So that notion of Iranian spies is something that strand of Islamists in Turkey really repeated time after time, and that's come all the way to today's politics, in a sense.
That's right. And I remember this conversation. This was, I think, 2009 or 10. Erdogan gave a talk at one of the think tanks here, and the Turkish scholar had this conversation with Erdogan where there was an audience question saying, why this must have been shortly after Turkey voted against Iranian sanctions at the United Nations. And someone asked a question, why Turkey voted against President Obama and in favor of engaging Iran. He didn't answer that publicly, but then in a private conversation, Erdogan said, what people in this town don't understand is when I talk with Khamenei, I speak with him in Turkish.
Mm-hmm.
So that was just this nationalist streak within Turkish Islamism, which I think is really interesting. I want to zoom out and talk about the societies themselves, Turkish and Iranian societies. People often point out that both countries carry deep imperial legacies and the strong sense of strong state tradition, and something that is often framed as a source of pride. But in Turkey's case, that strong state tradition evolved into a political culture where the state is treated almost as sacred. Citizens are expected to submit to, and even the reforms undertaken during the Ottoman Empire, they were all designed to protect and preserve the state, right? So, and that left very little room for a civic culture where the state is seen as a service institution, accountable to citizens. And I've always thought that this mentality has really hindered the development of a democratic political culture. So I want to ask you, do you see a similar dynamic in Iran? Is there the same kind of deeply embedded state-centric political culture there?
not in the same way. And I think this is one of the interesting contrasts between the two countries. Here, I mean, there's a bit of a risk of generalization, but I'll take that risk. This is like a contrast that I indulge in the book as well. State is at the heart of Turkish national identity, the notion of devlet. When you talk about Turkish nationalism or Turkish national identity, uh, immediate references are to the many states that the Turks have formed as they moved from, the story goes, Central Asia all the way to Anatolia. So the key association of Turkishness is with political authority.
Mm.
And that is different in the case of Iran, which first and foremost is a cultural, geographic, linguistic entity over which foreign entities pass. So other political authorities pass. So the symbolic, cultural, historical references have always foregrounded this notion of foreign political authority trampling upon our Iranian nation. And that has led to the emergence of what I would call a state-society antagonism in popular as well as political discourse, which is very different from the kind of state veneration that you just mentioned. I mean, state veneration is really core in Turkey, whether it's conservative or more liberal or Islamist or secular government. This notion of devletin bekası, the perpetuity of the state, is invoked time and again as the most existential purpose of government, even above serving the people in a sense. And in the case of Iran, that kind of veneration of an abstract notion of state, I think, isn't quite there. And that's something that the Islamic Republic struggled with and tried to replace that with leader veneration, which is very strong in Iran, a service to Islam, or service to the revolution, but not an abstract notion of the state. So, but this cuts both ways for both countries. And let me explain. In the case of Iran, if we're talking about a sort of set of references from pre-Islamic Iran in Shahnameh of Ferdowsi to Shia Iran, which is replete with references to struggle against tyranny, martyrdom, and fighting against justice, you give a lot of repertoire and a
And
lot of fuel for popular uprisings, of which there have been so many in the case of Iran. And in a sense, that, you might say, captures a sense of democratic essence, because
yeah,
there is a democratic essence in protest, right? But it
yeah.
makes institutional stability and continuity difficult. And this is what Homa Katuzian, an Oxford scholar of Iran, has called Iran a short-term society.
Mm.
By the same token, the same state veneration in Turkey, while crippling, as you said, the development of a democratic civic culture, has provided that institutional stability, or it's a result of institutional stability. The existence of a state is one thing that people attach themselves to.
Mm.
And because institutions have been there and robust in Turkey, that has allowed for the institutionalization of uh, a certain level of democracy. Because without institutions, you cannot have you cannot have procedural democracy.
Mm.
I would say, and even though it's imperfect, we have an experience of Turkish democracy, and that says something about the success of Turkish modernization. That goes back to the 19th century, Ottoman Tanzimat, but also under Kemalist Turkey. And Iran was much later to that game. I,
Mm.
in the book, compare Reza Shah, which is the great modernizer or centralizer of Iran, to Mahmud II and Abdulhamid, not to Mustafa Kemal. And his son, under his son, Muhammad Reza Shah, the state grew, became a behemoth for the first time. For in history, it was always this weakling, the central state. But it happened at the expense of societal links, which made it, which generated this antagonism with society. And also, let me just finish with this. Iran is a rentier state. Rentier state is not conducive for democratization if those democratic institutions are not there before the exploitation of the natural resource. So in that sense, I think this kind of state veneration we see in Turkey doesn't translate to Iran. There's a more distinct state-society antagonism, which we see again in display today.
I wonder whether that difference in the way these societies see the state has something to do with the difference in the frequency of protests. I mean, Iranian people, they seem like they take to the streets more often. And I wonder if that could be linked to how they don't see the state as the sacred thing, whereas in Turkey, I mean, that's how we grew up, right? You're, no matter what you do. I mean, my dad, he came from a socialist background, very held on to his oppositional identity, ideology, and yet even I would hear from him, the state, you need the state to survive. It's very interesting. I want to talk about the protests in Iran. I mean, obviously they've become more frequent, and public resentment toward the regime is clearly deepening. I mean, especially over its failure to deliver economically. Um, and this time, I spoke with many Iran analysts, and many of them thought that things felt different this time, that the protests were broader, angrier, and that the regime looked more vulnerable than before. But I remember, Karabekir, you were skeptical about claims that this could actually bring the system down. So take us through it. What brought Iran to this moment, and why were you cautious about predictions of regime collapse?
Sure. I think it's important not to take snapshots, but look at the trajectory, the process of change, political and social change in Iran over the last two and a half decades. And that trajectory shows us one long drawn out story of ultimately the inability of Iranian elites to respond to popular demands and grievances through the regime's own institutional and electoral channels. Now,
Yes.
there was a real chance that they could have done this. I mean, Iran could have turned a different corner, especially under the reformist government of Mohammad Khatami, who was president from 1997 to 2005. But internal and external dynamics prevented that from happening. And in the end, those who advocated change from within the system were categorically sidelined, marginalized, suppressed, imprisoned by those of those factions within the regime who viewed any type of opening or reform as a prelude to dissolution. These were people who were very much shaped in the experience of the 1979 revolution in Iran, of course, but also with very much spooked by the experience of the collapse of the Soviet Union. And they did not want a repeat of glasnost and perestroika in the Iranian case. And even the reformists' leadership, Khatami, at the time, was timid in pushing his prerogatives because he didn't want to be the Gorbachev
Mm.
of Iran. So over time, as demand for reform was stifled, the population and the causes of grievances were not addressed, and the people who could have addressed them within the Iranian elite were marginalized, and the only people who were left inside were the hardliners who only knew how to suppress in a sense. This set of grievances and frustrations grew and became a cascade of revolutionary demand. So what we see over the last 16, 17 years is the gradual loss of hope in reform and movement of protests from demanding change from within to demanding revolution, demanding the end of this regime. And there's of course a generational shift in there as well. The young generation now has only seen what the Islamic Republic has offered them, and they did not live through the revolution nor the Iran-Iraq war. So they are less tolerant with the Islamic Revolution, Islamic Republic. Why was I skeptical about predictions of regime collapse? Because I actually heard I agree with the analysis that the Iranian regime is in a much more vulnerable state at the moment, especially after the geopolitical turn of events following October 7, the collapse of its axis of resistance, and the 12-day war last summer, which exposed the degree to which Iran was strategically vulnerable. and the growing sort of dissatisfaction in society was also clear. However, when we look back at previous episodes of uprisings and conflict within Iran, um, there was always this expectation by analysts that this time it's different and now we might be something different. And I did not see necessarily that all of the prerequisites of a regime collapse in place. Now, this can happen. Regimes collapse or change overnight sometimes. There's no way for us to actually call for it, predict it. But there are certain aspects of the Iranian regime which still makes it relatively resilient. And that is, I think, especially focusing on elite cohesion. Well, those who were opposed to the current configuration of the Iranian regime have already been sidelined. So those who are on the inside are very committed. Their whole being depends on the continuity and survival of the Islamic Republic. So we haven't seen much elite defection, if you will. And second, the security forces are firmly behind the supreme leader. So those make the regime collapse less likely. And as long as those dynamics don't shift, and they can shift quickly, but we haven't seen a sign of that, I think the Iranian regime has the power to plow through, survive, but in a much more battered, delegitimized way that is ultimately leading to some sort of death. Maybe not today, but not in the very distant future.
Yeah, I mean, it reminds me of this famous line. Was it Hemingway when asked about how he went bankrupt? He said, "Well, two ways: gradually and then suddenly." So it
Hmm.
is. I mean,
Very
many
good.
people expect these protests to get more frequent, and then the regime could collapse in a very dramatic way. Going back,
Can I just add? Sorry, there's also, of course, there's a political agenda linked to this regime collapse discourse. If enough people are convinced that the regime is collapsing, um, there might be more investment in actually making it collapse.
yeah.
So that could mean pushing more people out to the streets or having the United States or Israel invest militarily in that prospect. So
Mm.
sometimes that type of expectation, wishful thinking or agenda, uh, takes the lead in analyzing the situation on the ground.
Finally, going back to this comparison with Turkey, in many ways, I mean, Turkey's regime is facing similar pressures, right? The economy is strained. One man rule has deepened institutional dysfunction, and public frustration is clearly growing. But we're not seeing the kind of sustained nationwide protest that could seriously shape the system the way some believe could happen in Iran. My first question is, why is that? And second, stepping back, are there lessons from Iran, both for Erdogan and for his opponents?
Yeah. I mean, to answer the first question, why is Turkey not experiencing the kind of sustained nationwide protests that we see in Iran? Um, well, there are levels to this thing, and in Turkey, things are bad and getting worse, but
Mm,
they're not still Iran kind of bad.
mm,
And you see this when you go to Iran or when Iranians come to visit Turkey. Uh, they say, well, this has not, you're living in a different reality than ours. So the economy is bad, but not as bad and hasn't been as bad as in the case of Iran. The country is not as isolated as Iran is. It's still one of the top tourist destinations. Um, and very importantly, up until recently, and this is an important, of course, potentially turning point, people still had hope in the democratic process, which is something that Iranians have lost over time. Um, and there's been hope that change can come again from within through our electoral system, which has provided change for decades in Turkey. And it's difficult to move away from it. And I think it would be a tragedy if Turks actually lose hope
mm,
in that potential for change. Um, Up until 2023, that was a big hope. Then, of course, the defeat of the opposition, crushed that hope. But what actually brought it back again was the resurgence of the opposition CHP, now with İmamoğlu and any kind of significant opposition figure who can threaten Erdogan being placed in prison. The legitimacy of the ballot box is being eroded. So I think at the moment, things are not as bad in Turkey as they are in Iran. We should also probably bring in this culture of protest in Iran, which we already talked about, isn't as prevalent in Turkey. But, and that's one of the lessons I guess we could talk about for Turkey, both for Erdogan and the opponents, is that there's an existential danger in eroding the legitimacy of the ballot box. It leads to a horror show that you don't want your country to enter into, a prolonged instability, distrust, and potential explosion of popular anger that could lead to a vicious cycle. For the opposition, I think the Iranian example also is a cautionary tale as to the lengths to which a strongman can go in order to stay in power, and a regime apparatus that is very much attached to that strongman and facing an existential crisis can go at great lengths in suppressing, repressing, killing its own people in order to stay in power. That's a prospect that everyone should want to avoid in Turkey, whether you're on the side of the government or in the opposition. So in that sense, I think Iran is a stark cautionary tale for Turkey.
Oh, this was a great conversation, Karabekir, and unfortunately we have to end it there. But thank you so much for joining my podcast. And again, congratulations on the book. It's a great book.
Thank you very much, Gönül. It was a pleasure.